Hi, everybody. My name is Eli Lake. I'm with the Washington Times and the New Republic, and I am delighted, and I think it's a great treat to have Hans-Inge Lango, who is a research assistant at the Norwegian Institute for Foreign Affairs. Is that correct?
International Affairs.
I'm sorry, International Affairs. And we are going to talk today about the Great Terror that the world watched on Friday. And let me just express, I think I speak for all Americans and all Blogging Heads viewers about our deepest gratitude, our deepest sympathies to the victims of this awful mass atrocity.
Well, thank you. It's been tremendous seeing the amount of support and condolences coming in over the past few days. And we do appreciate the support that's come in.
Anyway, so normally on Blogging Heads, I think viewers will see a kind of, a spirited discussion between two experts or journalists. Today, I think I want to start off by doing it more of a kind of interview style because I'm not Norwegian, but Hans is Norwegian. So I want to just start off and just kind of ask a very broad question. How is this incident going to change not only how Norwegian society thinks about terrorism, obviously, but also is it going to change how they think about criminality and its justice system? And kind of talk to me about what you think it's going to mean for Norway.
Well, I think it's difficult to predict now exactly how this is going to change us. But the first thing I would sort of look at is the way the Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, reacted to this. And he said that we will respond to this with more democracy, more debate. This will not affect our values and our principles of democracy. And I think you're seeing, if anything, this attack will have sort of a backlash against what the attacker intended, that people will rally around our fundamental liberal values. And I've seen, over the past couple of days, Facebook campaigns now saying that the answer to these attacks will be record turnouts in this fall's elections, local elections. And I think this might be a galvanizing event because people are very weary of having this sort of Patriot Act response where we sort of internalize or become isolated. I think that's one of it. But I also think this is it's sort of a brutal lesson that not all threats come from outside. And I think that was one of the hard realizations on Friday, because it started out, a lot of people assumed that this was a jihadi operation.
I did. I thought it was Al Qaeda.
Yes, and I sort of assumed that too, because Al Qaeda has made threats against Norway for its operations in Afghanistan and for its involvement in the Muhammad caricature scandal.
Right.
And so that was sort of the natural assumption. That didn't mean we thought that, this had to be the work of a Muslim. But it was sort of the logical conclusion that, Occam's razor, the most simple explanation here was that this is Al-Qaeda because of...
Well, Al-Qaeda, of course, is not Muslim. It is, they claim to be Muslims, and I'm not arguing that I'm not going to get into a theological dispute, but it is an ascetic and violent and radical interpretation of Islam.
No, exactly.
I don't fear the Muslims who work at the Washington Times. I don't fear Islam or Muslims per se. I fear Al Qaeda, fear Hezbollah. I don't want to say even fear is not the right word, because then we get into this whole question of Islamophobia. But let's get back to Norway for a second, because there's a couple things I want to press you on.
Yes.
Many Americans in the last few days have been fascinated because, you have this, you have the villain, he has a manifesto. Everyone agrees that he's pure evil, what he's done. So immediately thoughts come to how will he be punished in the Norwegian penal system. And so these articles, and we talked about this a little bit last night, Um, I'm thinking of one in the Daily Mail, which is the world's poshest prison.
Yes.
And I was reading this article and looking at the photos, and I have to say, this prison is nicer than some of the dorms at my very expensive liberal arts college. So why does Norway have such beautiful prisons? And it seems like that's not really. I know that their freedom of movement's taken away, but it seems like that there's not really a disincentive if you go off to a place that has flat screen televisions.
Well, I think this sort of goes back to the liberal notion of rehabilitation.
Yeah.
And there is this, and it's a very persuasive theme in Norwegian justice system, and the political side of it is that there is to be a very strong focus on rehabilitation. And so you have not just very modern prisons, but you have also systems where you slowly acclimatize prisoners back into society.
Okay, and that's. I'm not getting into a debate about, Hobbes versus Bentham, but do you believe that Anders Behring Breivik should go to this kind of prison? I mean, he's just somebody who I think you kind of have to say, throw him in a hole and throw away the key. Is this incident going to have people think that maybe there should be something tougher for the worst of the worst or something like that?
It's a difficult question. He's going to be locked away, probably for the rest of his life.
Okay.
And whether or not he has bars on his windows, I'm not sure people are that concerned about. I think some might object in Norwegian society if he is allowed to pursue education, have a very sort of.
What about giving interviews?
Well, that might be an issue. It's unclear how much leeway he will have if he is convicted. Keep in mind he has not been convicted, even though he has admitted to perpetrating the acts. I'm not sure yet how they would handle this, and it would be an interesting debate to see how he will be treated by the justice system. But of course, there is the issue of whether or not he will be allowed to do interviews, whether or not he will be allowed to publicize writings, etc.
Mm-hmm. Do you get the impression that there's a risk here that if he's afforded all of the, say, freedoms as a guy like Mullah Krekar, which we can get to in a second, that he can become a kind of an inspirational figure for I don't know if there is such a radical right terrorist movement. And I want to get into this because I actually think many on the left have overstated this guy's affiliation to the right, because I certainly don't think there's anything right-wing about his manifesto, which is quite utopian. And yes, he's read right-wing websites, and he's familiar with a certain kind of critique of Islamism or Islam in Europe, and he says he subscribes to that critique. But at the same time, what this guy did is not something I think that you could say is condoned by the writers that he cited in his manifesto. But leaving that aside, if you give this guy a platform and a trial and opportunity to communicate with the outside world, are you risking the prospect of turning him into some sort of cult leader?
That's always a fear. But I'm not sure the alternative would be much better. Clamping down on his freedom of speech, allowing him or not allowing him to speak his mind. So I'm not sure if the best way to handle these kinds of ideas and these kinds of radical individuals is to clamp down on their free speech. I think this is what we've seen on the continent, is a lot of people have supported these sort of far-right movements is because they've seen what they perceive to be the government clamping down on their freedom of expression. there was a Dutch cartoonist who was arrested because he had made a caricature that allegedly offended Islam.
Where was he arrested?
In Denmark. No, sorry, in the Netherlands.
Right, okay.
And this was perceived by a lot of people as sort of offensive, that he would be arrested for using his free speech. And this is some issues that sort of galvanize the far right movement, if you want to call it that.
Well, so let's dive right in, okay? Because in the U.S. blogosphere and people who kind of follow this, there's been a bit of a debate over this two essays or one essay on Pajamas Media by Bruce Bauer. And I've never met Bruce Bauer, but I've read him for years, and I don't consider him to be, I think he's a much more nuanced and supple thinker than Robert Spencer and some of the other writers who I think are just trying to say that radical Islam is the equivalent of all Islam, and that's not something I agree with. But Bruce Bauer has been a critic of what he sees as political Islam in Europe. And one of the things that he wrote, which I guess struck a nerve, I mean, Andrew Sullivan, lots of American bloggers wrote about this. And he wrote, and I want to just read this to you and get your response, and then we can really jump into it. He said, yesterday's events then represent a double tragedy for Norway. Not only has it lost almost 100 people, including dozens of young people, in a senseless rampage of violence, but I fear that legitimate criticism of Islam, which remains a very real threat to freedom in Norway and the West, has been profoundly discredited in the eyes of many Norwegians by association with this murderous lunatic. I want to get your response to that. Do you feel that Bauer stepped over the line by writing that, and do you think what Bauer said is true?
No, I don't think what Bauer said was true. Just
okay.
Put that out there. I think the threat, and this is a personal opinion, the threat is vastly overrated. As for whether or not it seems to me to be tasteless. Like he can make this argument that there is a debate to be had about integration.
Mm-hmm. And Bauer, we should say, Bauer's a Swede, right?
I'm not entirely sure.
I think Bauer lives in Scandinavia.
Well, I think he lives in Oslo, actually.
Oh, okay, so he lives in Oslo.
But I think he's American, if I remember correctly.
Okay, anyway. And we should also say that I mean, Bauer is gay, and one of the things that he writes about is Islamophobia, or I'm sorry, he writes about the anti-gay bigotry of many of the kind of Islamist groups or political Islamic groups that he's run across in Europe.
Just from a personal perspective, it strikes me as tasteless to within days, sort of
24 hours.
Yeah, jump in and say, say these acts were despicable, but there is some of the, at least one of the views held by the killer is a legitimate concern.
That gets into this very interesting thing, because I don't think that I want to resist. Well, let me just first of all ask you: do you feel that? And let's leave Bruce Bauer, because I think it's just unfair to lump Bauer into the same graph as Andrew Postum or Pamela Gellers or Robert Spencer, which are more strident, and also they critique all of Islam. And they tend to be American-based, or some of the far right-wing parties that this guy definitely felt an affinity towards. Because I don't think Bauer is a right-winger in any stretch. So he's not with the fascist parties of Europe or the English Defense League or things like that. And I think it's very important to distinguish between those things. But let's just talk for a second about the idea that he seemed to have done this because he does think that, or a big part of what he wrote was that he thinks that Islam is taking over Europe, and that, eventually Europe will cease to be Europe and they'll be part of the Islamic world. and you think that threat is vastly overstated. So I want to hear why that's vastly overstated in Norway, and then I want to come back with some of the things that Bauer claims in his article.
Well, let me just first say that a lot of the support for these sort of right-wing ideas, there are also some on the left that oppose immigration, especially from non-Western world. A lot of the reason behind this is not just because of the effects of immigration, but also larger social and economic reasons. And, there's a lot of antipathy towards the EU, for example, and you have lower middle class or working class people who've seen their lost their jobs, not necessarily because of immigration,
right?
But then support these right wing parties that are strictly anti-immigration because partly some believe because they genuinely believe that immigration is a problem, but some also support them because it's a protest vote against the establishment.
Well, just to give you a sense and how old I am, but in 1993, when I was an exchange student in Denmark, living in Albertslund outside of Copenhagen, I remember attending anti-EU rallies in which the Norse god of Thor was often invoked. Mm-hmm. So I remember seeing this there was not a tinge of anti-Islamism in it. It was purely against the EU, and they wanted, they didn't like the idea. They thought that they wanted to be Denmark, and they didn't want to be Europe. So that was definitely a sense that I remember when I lived in Europe that I picked up.
Mm. But yes, to get back to your question.
Sorry to take us down that tangent.
Yeah, no. The reason I say this is, Norway is sort of a different country. We haven't had the same rates of unemployment and violence.
Yeah, you have a bunch of oil.
Yes, exactly. And we've traditionally been a very homogeneous society, whereas a lot of the continental countries have seen a lot more immigration.
Just curious, as a little side note, but did Norway have anything equivalent of the Baader-Meinhof or the Red Army faction in the 1970s and the 1980s? Did it have any left-wing terrorism like that?
Not necessarily terrorism, but there were radical left-wing groups and political parties that were, like I said, radical groups that had. This is not my expertise. I don't want to get too bogged down into details, but they had aspirations of overthrowing the government.
Okay. All right. Okay. So moving on, your point about the kind of the right wing sentiment in Norway.
Mm-hmm. Well, even though it's on a smaller scale than on continental Europe, there are substantial amount of people that are very skeptical of immigration,
right?
Because you have crime statistics where non-Western immigrants or descendants of non-Western immigrants are overrepresented in certain categories, and this is over the past decade, 2 decades maybe, helped rally part of the right, especially the Progress Party, which has historically been an anti-tax party, but has also used anti-immigrant sentiments to garner more political and popular support.
So the Center for Norwegian Progress is very different than the Center for American Progress.
Yes.
That's a wonk joke, people. Okay. All right. So, so the Progress Party has traditionally, but you don't think this guy is he's bananas. This guy is a utopian. He doesn't, he's read a lot. It's possible to be a utopian and a lunatic and still, be learned, I suppose. And I don't want to say he's really like a learned, I'm just saying he's not stupid, but, would you ever go so far as to say that would you pick some sort of conservative thinker, an a Muslim skeptic? He quoted Bauer in his manifesto, but I mean, you can't say that Bauer is anything close to like the equivalent of an Abu Musab Zarqawi, for example, right? Or an Anwar al-Awlaki.
No,
right.
Because these,
right.
As far as I know, I haven't studied them in detail. They do not, advocate directly violence.
Yeah, and there isn't as best as we know. I mean, this guy claims that there's that he has other comrades who are willing to take up action, which is scary and problematic. But as far as we know, there isn't anything like the kind of global network that Al-Qaeda has or once had, or for that matter, any of these other terrorist groups. And then add on top of that a layer of state ideological support and support through some of these huge charities. It's just, I don't think you can really compare the problem, the two things, even though this is obviously a horrible example of what we'd say right-wing inspired terrorism. But it's not like that we have a right-wing terrorism problem that is the same as the jihadist terrorism problem, right?
No,
right.
I do agree with you on that.
Yeah. Okay.
But
and it's not say that we shouldn't expend the same amount of resources against those things either.
No, what I think the fear is now, or the fear will become because of Friday's attacks, is that this type of right-wing ideology will serve as a foundation for what you've seen with jihadist terrorist organizations. I'm not saying necessarily that will happen, but that is one thing you might be concerned about, is that there will be a network eventually.
So Breivik is the he's not dead, but he's like a martyr figure in some ways. He
could become, again, this is speculation, but there is concern in Europe, in the intelligence community, that there is a rising right-wing radical threat.
Okay, well, I want to go back to Bauer's very, I actually have to say I commend him for writing something this fiercely honest, knowing in the wake of the tragedy that he would come under a lot of criticism. So in his Pajamas Media piece, and he also wrote something for the Wall Street Journal, but in his Pajamas Media piece, he goes through a list of things, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to kind of just put them against a Norwegian who's done journalism on this stuff. So let's just go through his list of particulars of what he says the Norwegian government and its cultural establishment have striven to communicate to even the most extreme elements of international Islam that they want to be friends. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he comes up with a couple of these examples. So let's go. The first one, he talks about Justine Gardner, who wrote a book called Sophie's World, and he said he published this op-ed a few years back declaring his contempt for Israel and the Jewish people. And when some people criticized him, many members of the Norwegian cultural elite rushed to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. I must admit, I don't know anything about this particular incident. Do you remember that?
I'm not sure I do, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, so then let's move on. I don't want to get into stuff. So let's talk about something we both know about, which is Mullah Krekar. Now, yes. Mullah Krekar is one of the world's great scumbags. He was a founder of Ansar al-Islam, and we know that he was basically this jihadist terrorist leader. He still has some access, I guess, to the internet, and the Iraqis, and particularly the Kurds, have wanted Norway to extradite Mullah Krekar to Iraq, where he'll face justice. And I guess because they're afraid of the death penalty, Norway's government has not done that. And over the years, there have been, profiles of Mullah Krekar in which he's, made all kinds of threats against people, and he stays in a flat in Oslo. A few years back, about a year ago, a television show which unfortunately never really got going, which was looking to kind of track down people who were like on the lam from international law, went to Norway and actually filmed filmed Mullah Krekar coming in and I was, for a U.S. audience, and kind of made the case against him as he's for his crimes against humanity. So, Hans, what can you sort of say about that situation? Because that strikes me as something that would be frustrating. Forget to right-wing anti-Islamist types. It's frustrating to people, who've familiar with this guy's rap sheet in Iraq and so forth. Frustrating to the Iraqi government, frustrating to people who, and to the international justice system.
Well, just to put that out there immediately, most Norwegians, just about everyone I know, are sick and tired of the story.
Okay.
Meaning that most Norwegians want him out.
Oh, they do? Okay.
And they've wanted him out for quite some time. And most of the political establishment, too, want him out. But it's, again, this is where they've been caught in the dilemma, because Norway has a stated policy that they do not extradite people when they risk execution or torture in their home country. And so, and I believe the government on this, that they do want to extradite him. They feel compelled not to because of the risk of him being executed. And they've actually sought out the Kurdish authorities and asked for guarantees that he will not be tortured or executed. But the authorities have been unable or unwilling to provide.
No. I think they have actually. My understanding of the case is that the Kurds have said they wouldn't do it, but the Norwegians don't believe them.
That might be correct. That's.
And from the Kurdish perspective, I might add, because this guy tried to kill Barham Saleh, who is now, I think, the prime minister of the Kurdistan regional government. Norway is harboring, a mass murdering terrorist. I mean, it's like you guys are, you're in from the Kurdish perspective.
No, it's sort of an absurd situation.
Yeah. But doesn't Norway, like most European countries, have some sort of universal jurisdiction here? I mean, concept in their courts, or couldn't they try him for this stuff and, instead of having him kind of live his life?
I'm not entirely sure why that hasn't happened, but I know the police security service has worked fairly actively trying to pin something on him. And that's why they indicted him a few days ago.
Oh, okay.
On threats against a member of the parliament, among other things, right. Because he makes very insightful speeches. And so they're now going to...
And you mean inciting? Insightful would mean like profound or something, but they're...
Yes.
No,
Apologies.
he's like he's filled with bile. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on. And this is great. This is great. It's a great opportunity to have a Norwegian as intelligent as you are, who's studied these things. So let's move to the next thing. And this was, again, this is something I did not know, but viewers may remember the Danish Muhammad cartoons, and there was a Norwegian magazine called Magasinet, which I guess is an evangelical publication, and the editor of it, Vebjørn Selbekk.
Vebjørn Selbekk.
Yes, Vebjørn Selbekk, and you told me you've interviewed him. He published some of the Muhammad cartoons, and he was denounced and pressured, and then I guess the way that Bauer says it is that he eventually buckled and gave a public apology before Norwegian imams, and I'm quoting Bauer here, begged their forgiveness for having exercised his freedom of speech. Then he says the top government officials looked on in satisfaction, and a delegation led by a bishop from the Church of Norway traveled to Yemen to deliver the happy tidings of this capitulation, and I'm reading from Bauer, happy tidings of this capitulation to the theologian widely viewed as the closest thing to a Muslim pope, Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And just for the readers to know, Yusuf al-Qaradawi is one of the top Muslim Brotherhood figures in the world. And he has a weekly show on Al Jazeera. He's based in Qatar. And he spews absolute venom about Jews, Christians, Israel, the West. He's a 9/11 conspiracy guy. Here's somebody who, in my opinion, has put forth far more venomous, inciting stuff than the Muhammad cartoons, in my view. and yet a bishop of the Church of Norway is effectively apologizing to him. I mean, that just strikes me as a kind of moment of, it's like almost a kind of cultural perversion in some ways. So, does Bauer get his facts right? That's my first question.
Well, to sort of disentangle, let me just say as a preface, when I interviewed him, Selbach, he was on a book tour. This was sometime after the death threats and everything, but he still had bodyguards from the police with him. I remember this leaving sort of an impression on me. He had 2 bodyguards with him, if I remember correctly. I do not remember specifically the event that he mentions about in front of the Norwegian imams, but it's not my impression that he apologized and begged for forgiveness. In fact, he's been the opposite. He has been the one who stood firm defending his right to free speech. There was after the Muhammad caricature episode, there was a lot of soul searching, at least in the media, on what had happened, because as the story was playing out, a lot of the Norwegian press decided not to back Magazine. And later on, at least some of the members of the media came to the realization that they had been they'd acted cowardly or had not been principled enough.
Okay,
So
that's interesting. So there was actually a backlash to what Bauer described as a capitulation among the media elite itself. Is that what you're saying?
At least part of it, yes.
Okay.
And the government was also criticized in retrospect for sort of using Magazine as a scapegoat, because other more mainstream media had printed the caricatures as well. But
I remember when this scandal broke. I was living in Cairo writing for the New York Sun, and I interviewed I spent a bit of time with the Danish consul at their embassy in Cairo, and I couldn't believe it. He was telling me that he had to basically tell crowds in the government that the Denmark, there were all these lies that were spread, but he had to basically say, listen, we would take actions against people who would burn the Quran, and like all these things that he had to say that amounted to, in some ways, him apologizing for being in part of this free society. Danish products were still nonetheless boycotted by the nation of Egypt for the most part, and I felt that it was a really ugly moment because the people who I was friends with in Cairo, who I considered to be, sophisticated, they spoke English, they agreed with me that this was a manufactured controversy, but their view was like it's had no effect on like kind of the public, either the Egyptian media or like how it was dealt with in any way. So I just felt like that there was this. I knew I had experience with plenty of people in Cairo who thought this was all crap, but at the same time, their voice did not enter into that debate. And I was concerned, and I know this is a little bit of a tangent, that the Danish approach and what appears to be the Norwegian government approach was to almost capitulate to the most extreme people who may not and probably don't necessarily represent everyone in the Muslim world, but because they scream the loudest, they get the most attention.
Yeah. I think the Norwegian government was trying to walk a fine line on this issue.
Right.
They said very, very. They stood firm on the fact that they couldn't do anything. This is a democracy. They didn't have the ability to censor the media, and held their principles on that respect. But at the same time, sort of distancing themselves from the media who had published the cartoons. And that was, in retrospect, criticized as being too cowardly or being not principled enough.
Well, this is fascinating. This is really good. So here's my question as we wrap this up, Hans, and thank you so much for your time to do this. Bauer laments that the Great Terror of Friday will make it difficult to have a question about radical elements in Norway and grapple with this. I gather from this conversation that you actually don't think that's the case.
There is a real discussion to be had about issues with immigration, and
okay.
But me personally, I think what Bauer and some of the others say are they hide the threat, so to speak, and there's some too much generalization, I think. But again, I don't want Friday's acts to become sort of to become something that we used to call a debate.
Well, I want to ask it a different way then, because what is there something in Bauer's critique that's true?
You'll have to be more specific.
Is there something about what is he pinpointing something? He talks. I we could go into more of his details. I would urge people to read Bauer's piece and then read the criticism of Bauer's piece. Get into read everything. But is there something that what he's pointing out? He's saying, listen, there are a lot of people coming into Norway, a lot of people coming into Europe who have no interest in becoming Norwegians or Swedes or Germans. They want to be Muslims, and their view of how the rules that they should follow are not compatible with Western society. And we see that with threats against Theo Van Gogh. Mm-hmm. We see that with the riots on the Muhammad cartoons, and we see this, he points to sort of spates of violence and stuff. And we could, there were things like this that happened in France, and continental Europe has not been immune to these kind of these flashpoints. Now, you're saying you think it's overblown. You think that he exaggerates that threat, and I think that that's valid. But I'm saying, is there something about that, what he's saying, that also, is true, that maybe there needs to be a different approach?
It's a very complicated problem, and of course there are elements that are radical or that do not want to conform to European society.
Right.
I don't think anyone's arguing that, but I think that part of the immigrant population is very small, and we also have to look at it from sort of our perspective, in that how do we receive these immigrants, and this is one of the main differences between Europe and the U.S. There are two very vastly different ways of not necessarily assimilating, but taking in immigrants. Whereas in the U.S., if you get a citizenship and you say I want to be American, you're American. Whereas in Europe, nationality has historically been an issue of ethnicity, so to put broadly. And so Europe is still in transition there, where they're trying to reconcile those old traditions with the influx of new peoples. But I do think it is important to note some of the criticism that comes from Bauer and others, in that a lot of the government responses have been perceived as very naive in terms of immigrants. And this is where a lot of the right-wing parties get their support, because they see governments that surrender their principles because they want to integrate the new population.
Well, I guess I don't live in Europe, but it seems that in certain examples that that in Europe there are ghettos, where you have almost entirely Muslims, and they run affairs as, their own way, which is not cohering with, they're not integrating. And America is very different because, we don't have, long traditions of kind of a noble class or anything like that, and you can lose a fortune or make a fortune in your own lifetime here. And so I think sometimes in this country, there's a group of people who want to say that it's just like, Europe is coming here. But I think that there are things that in America that make it harder for them to sort of set up these very segregated communities that appear to exist a lot in Europe. And maybe as we're just wrapping up here, Hans, maybe you want to talk about that. Is that something that maybe we should? I mean, I know it's strange because, we're seeing like the kind of radical and insane expression of somebody, causing this. But I do think, though, that in some ways, this is an interesting question about whether or not this is, what it will mean to that debate, And I think you've been very honest about it.
No, it's like I said, it's a very complicated discussion, but we have to take an honest look at the debate because, this all ties in with the manifesto of Breivik, in that he has taken some of these ideas and just driven them to the extreme.
Right. Well, he's a lunatic. Anybody, and like, I'm happy that if he discredits fascist parties in Europe, that to me is not interesting at all. What is interesting is that there have been, there's European conservatives who are very concerned about political Islam in Europe. Sometimes they get into an essentialist critique of all Muslims, which I think is wrong, but they certainly have identified something that we can associate with the movement founded by Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood, and what is its effect in Europe, and what kind of threat it poses. And it need not just be a threat of, potential terrorism or riots, violence. It could be very much of an ideological threat. It could be a legal threat. So that to me is an interesting discussion. And insofar as you have this mass murderer terrorist who has clinged on to it, what is it? What? I mean, maybe we can't answer it. I think it's maybe too soon to say what effect it would be. But your insights have been really great and very valuable. So I want to thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having the time to talk to me.
And I hope the readers liked it. I appreciate it. And I could ask you questions about Norway. We could talk about that. Do you guys ever miss being Vikings? You ever just want to conquer Iceland?
Well, the Icelandic people are coming to us now because of the financial crisis.
Right, because of they can't manage their economies. Right. But there was a time when the Vikings ruled the world.
Yeah, well, it's been a while now. So instead, we've become a nation of peace, or we try to be at least.
I know. Scandinavians are so into peace. All right. Listen, thank you so much. And maybe we could do it again. And thank you, viewers. I hope everybody liked this. Okay?
Thank you.